Welcome to episode 396 of the Barcelona podcast, brought to you by the Blue Wire Podcast Network. I'm Dan Hilton, and joining me from the Liga Lowdown is their Barcelona correspondent and yours today, and that is Román de Arquer. How's it going, Román?
It's going good. Happy for Spain's victory the other day against Portugal, of course, and now looking forward to club football, which is what really, I think, interests us most.
Yeah, I get in too much trouble when I talk too much about the international stuff with the Kool-Aids here for the Barcelona podcast fan base. But I will say that during the World Cup, they're kind of going to have to suck it up because I'm not sure what else there is to possibly do other than give them injury updates on certain players. Again, hopefully there are none, but let's get into that pretty quickly, actually, because today we have a special listener question-driven show. We're going to kind of dive right in because I felt like earlier in the week, I did the women's show last week. And then early in this week, we did all about the injuries. We're kind of rehashing some of that stuff again. But I felt kind of rudderless where there was no new news. It was kind of just treading water, waiting for a big October where we're able to talk about the football. So with the final show, before we can talk about football again, basically every 3 days for the next month and a half, it's going to be a sprint. And then finally the World Cup comes. But we do start with injuries, with questions from, we got a number of questions on injuries. That's why it's our main topic here. Aman, Abbas, Jose all asked different variations of the same question. Ayman, to be particular, asked, do you think the team was not physically well prepared, thus all the injuries now, and why did it happen with the national teams and not the club? Abbas asked, was it known to the club that Koundé had suffered the same injury and was supposed to do surgery? How injury prone is Araujo? Every time he goes for international duty, we have to be worried. And then Jose says, with injuries already stacking up, how do you think the team will look player availability wise after the World Cup? So 3 kind of different questions there. And Roman, I'll let you kind of pick and choose which ones or which parts of those, the sentiment that you want to answer.
Well, first of all, the first one saying that if the players were actually well prepared, I do think they're well prepared. But the problem is that when they go to play with their national teams, they're submerged into a different routine, a different lifestyle, we could say in a way. Because, for example, with the club, they have full control of the players. They're like specific and individualized trainings for each one. They have all the data. They control their day-to-day life. Whereas the national team can ask for some of this information, but of course it has to train in a different way because it's got players from different clubs. It can go specifically to train in a way that they do in their own club. So of course this definitely has an impact on the players' physical conditions after, and also the routines. Not just how the time they wake up, maybe have breakfast, etc., but also the fact that they have more prevention sessions maybe at Barça, whereas in the Spanish national team they might not have. And other reasons for injuries usually coming up with national teams, I think, is also the fact that they can play in different positions, which can have different requirements from the player, and they're not used to maybe that way of playing, and definitely that can have an impact on your physical condition. Like, for example, Koundé, who's been playing very often here as a right back. If he plays maybe center back, different requirements, difficult physical requirements can lead to an injury. And finally, I'd say that maybe having more game time, such as Memphis Depay, who hasn't been playing too much here, for example, at Barca, when he goes to his national team, he's their main man, we could say. So, of course, his body maybe isn't used to all this. So I think there's just a big bunch of factors, in this case that lead to a player likely becoming injured with their national team, whereas in the club, they seem okay and everything's all right, because also a good example is Sergio Roberto, who before being injured here in Barca, they detected something was wrong. So they immediately pulled him away from the squad and have been helping him recover so that the injury doesn't go too much worse. And hopefully he'll be available for the next match.
Roman, a quick question for you here. I have a question. Did you in some way steal my notes? Did you get a copy of my notes prior to this recording? Because what I have written here in front of me for some of the notes that I took before as I was trying to work through these questions and answer them is, firstly, at their clubs, players basically have someone on staff aiding in every part of their footballing life, particularly individual training and timely recovery. So very much as you said, the next thing I wrote here was the enhanced travel means a difference in their regular routine being the key word there. Travel may prevent time for proper lifting or meals that were prepared by the club in different ways. The most minor dietary things, again, where they're individual to team, I think was the biggest disparity that seems to be, the quote unquote reasoning, where when you go for the international stuff, they're doing everything as a group, usually everything is a total unit, and very little individual work. Where for this season in particular, because last season and the season before, there were big arguments about why are Barcelona players constantly getting injured? Obviously, Dembele was one of the big examples for that. And then he has come out and said, hey, I also got more mature. I fix things individually on my end, from the non-footballing side of things and to help with the injuries. But, Barcelona, with Xavi coming in this year, again, bringing back Ricard Pruna, the main physio from years past, from his heyday, that being Xavi's, Barcelona is ironically prioritizing prevention this year based on individual player data and checking that data, as you said, data was the word you used as well. So checking that data daily, which apparently is one of the reasons why, and to that point, that we haven't seen much of Sergio Roberto, because what I've heard different reporting things about his Achilles still not being great, but I've also heard that he could go if he had to, but because of the emphasis on that daily work, daily grind of looking at that data, they just don't trust Roberto at this point. If he feels even a little bit of a snag, he says, hey, I got to come off the field. That's it for me. And that's why we haven't seen too much of Roberto. Because, again, I think in years past, even, this is no disrespect to the managers in charge, but he might have kind of been thrown out there. He might have been asked to go, as you will. So we're seeing from Barcelona this year a lot more precaution towards these players. And that could also lead to something where players are now on their club side saying, hey, that's enough for me for the day, or I need to go into individual stuff. And so they're being very careful with these players. And then for the national team, not to say that they're trying to hurt them, but they do throw caution to the wind. That's why it seems like there's always a FIFA virus. So I think we did a pretty good job answering those questions. I think the only one we didn't really hit was Jose's, and that is with injuries stacking up. How do you think the team will look for player availability wise? And, as much as I would worry a lot, the plane ride obviously getting in there, but they take a lot of time. They spend a lot of time in those countries prior to the World Cup, right? It depends on how long each of these countries are. Some of them are there for 5 days. Some are there for 10 days. It really depends on how they choose the location of where they're setting up. But apparently in Qatar, unlike the 2014 World Cup in Brazil, or even in Russia in 2018, it seems like a lot of the camps are very centralized. So there's a lot less travel. You saw a map of how close all the stadiums are in comparison to each other. Again, there are pros and cons to having the World Cup where it is now. A con is, again, a human rights thing that will continue to pepper into every one of these shows for a while. But one of the positives for the players is that, again, the locale of where they're located, from stadium to camp and stadium to stadium even, limits the travel, which is going to be helpful for injury prevention, hopefully. The other thing, too, is that you would expect that a lot of players on Barcelona are teams that are going to make the knockout rounds, right? It's not like they're going to show up, play three games, and go out. I mean, who knows, right? Who knows how, one of those big giants or two of those big giants always crashes out in the group stage. That's just kind of a given with the World Cup. There's chance and there's whatever. But, I'd say that play availability-wise, I would actually hope that there's even less injuries that we saw in this international break, because this international break, you're still talking about 2 games total from these teams. And we've seen in the past that some international breaks, they try to fit 3 games in because of Nations League and World Cup or whatever. So the World Cup is actually a little more spread out. In theory, there's 3 to 5, at most 7 games with the World Cup. So, I'm actually hopeful about that, believe it or not. And then Araujo, to wrap that up, injury prone. He was injury prone before this break. I mean, he's unfortunately going to be an injury prone player. And that's going to be a consideration. I saw somebody in the Facebook group put Thomas Vermaelen, and I had a cold chill go down my spine because, I mean, maybe that's it. I mean, that might be it to it. But I think Araujo, you just hope that he can shake it off eventually. And that's why he had the surgery, so that it's not just permanent.
And I just wanted to add, I think that injury wasn't just sudden. If you look at what happened, it was just before a minute when he got injured, and nothing really out of place happened to him. So there was definitely something there before he got to the game. I don't know if he was feeling it while he was at his national team, or maybe at Barca and he kept it to himself. But that wasn't just happening at that specific time. It should have been taken care of before, and maybe we could have avoided this. But unfortunately, it wasn't the case, and we're gonna miss him.
Yeah, so let's move topics a little bit here. Jorge asks, the frustration with Ferran Torres seems to be growing and coming from all angles. Is it possible to resurrect his career? It's funny, he's 22 years old. Or is this just another bust? Could we get any money back for him? Román, I think I am barred from talking about Ferran Torres for like 2 or 3 weeks. I think he has to do something, has to happen for me to have much to say. So yes, we'd love to hear your Ferran Torres take.
I mean, I think people are being a bit harsh with Ferran Torres, in my personal opinion. I mean, he was very important for us when he came last season to qualify for the Champions League, to climb up those positions in La Liga. And he was important going forward, scoring goals and giving assists. And of course, Now he's found that he has Sunday instead of Aubameyang and Memphis. He now has Rafinha there, a good Dembele, Lewandowski. So there's so much more competition, and Sufati is recovered from his injury. So I think from a psychological perspective, I do feel that maybe, he went from feeling more of a star player to now seeing that there's better players ahead of him, and that of course is something that has possibly affected his performances. Also, it's not good that he ended last season not in the best way. You could tell that he was already not playing at the same high level that he was when he came in. So I mean, all these things have affected a bit his performances, but we've seen how good he can be. I think he can be a very useful player for us. I don't know, maybe not a starter, but I mean definitely a very strong backup player. And it's true that Luis Enrique has also found it hard to get the best out of him. So I think it's more of a psychological thing at this point, because we know he has the quality. He's a very decent player, a very good player, and it's just a matter of him, breaking past that moment of not depression, but of his low moment. And once he gets past that, I think he'll be a very good player. If some club in the future comes with money and they want to sell him, okay, because of course Barca needs all the money they can get. But I don't see him being a player they'd want to sell just now, and of course his value might not be as high as when they signed him because how he's been performing lately. But overall, I think he's a fantastic player, and I just give him time and trust, and let him do his thing. Sometimes it's hard, and players need some confidence.
Well, yeah, I think the general rule of thumb should be, I mean, Messi, Xavi, Guardiola, regardless of who like all the people and figures and legends that are lionized, they all say the same thing. It takes time to get used to playing at Barcelona. And I think there was a period there where, no disrespect to Ernesto Valverde, but he kind of did things a different way that wasn't as dogmatic, for better or worse. I mean, he won trophies at Barcelona, being a little less dogmatic than what we'd expect from the FC Barcelona. And I think Xavi getting back to that dogmatic approach kind of reminds you that to get used to quote unquote Barca's system that these young players are supposed to learn from the academy all the way up through. I think there is something that directly correlates with Ferran Torres kind of struggling to find his feet again this season, having not done the preseason, and a player like Alejandro Balde coming from the academy, kind of looking very comfortable and breaking out in the way he is. I think that, again, there is something dogmatic at work here where these academy products are having an okay time in kind of getting their footing in the first team because of the way that Xavi is going about his approach to
Mm-hmm.
training, to his approach to what he's looking for in his players. And so basically anybody else that is not of that, not even mindset, but that didn't come up through that Barcelona academy is going to take some time, as we're always warned by these legends. These legends always say, give these players a year. And I think that year could even be extended for players under the age of 23 who are not yet fully formed. Remember that Ferran Torres went from Valencia, where he could have arguably been, well, he was a star, I think, already as a teenager. And then
Mm-hmm.
they asked, he wanted to be a captain. They said no because he was 19 years old. Then he moves to Man City, where he is kind of just this role player, of course, in a very talented team. And he would come in to close out games in the final minutes. And I think that is where he could fit at Barcelona too. But it's not even about resurrecting his career. It's about him not only getting accustomed to Barcelona, but also figuring out where he fits, because he, as a player, is very divergent from what Xavi asks of his wingers. So if he is a winger, which is what it looks like he is for Xavi, Dembele, Rafinha, and Ansu, well, Ansu, that's a different thing for a different day. I don't even have an Ansu question, which thank goodness, because we're going to do that later, but on a different day. But for Dembele and Rafinha, they start because they go wide. That's what Xavi wants from his wingers. It's why Rafinha is kind of, you can tell that he's always of two minds when he comes to cut in, because he knows what his job is. He knows what his role is, and that's to create space by hugging that touchline. And that's not who Ferran Torres is. He's going to cut in every single time. In truth, in Xavi's system, he should be kind of this false nine, center forward type situation, but he doesn't really have the physical tools to be this hold up player or to kind of replicate even 80% of what Lewandowski gives you. His finishing is not the same. And yet, as you said, last season, to put numbers to what you said, he managed to have 14 total goal contributions, which was tied for second most for the team last season. That being Memphis with 15, and then it was Aubameyang and Ferran Torres with 14, both of which picked those up from January until the end of the season in May. So even last season, there were critics, and yet there was this end product, this end result. And so, like, which do you want? Do you want him to be kind of, not overplayed, but do you want him to have to be this leading figure in a team that probably isn't as good, or do you want him to play second fiddle to Lewandowski and Aubameyang not Aubameyang, Dembele and Rafinha. And then again, even Ansu, people are starting to criticize, but I want to remind you that you have this insane strike force, right? Like Lewandowski is just, he can't stop scoring at an insane clip.
Mhm.
So I think our reaction to Ferran Torres is a bit of everything, where he's struggling to fully find his footing, yes, but also Barcelona are flying high right now. They've got the best defense in all of Europe with 0.17 goals per 90 minutes. And so you always have to feel like you have to find somebody to scapegoat when things go wrong, or why is things not perfect, or why are you afraid that Barcelona aren't going to win a Champions League, and that has to be pinned on certain players, right? So there always has to be a scapegoat, and I think right now that's Ferran Torres,
Yeah.
and that's why it continues to be in the media.
Yeah, pretty much pinpoint what you said. It's like in the national team, everyone goes against Ferran Torres, also against Luis Enrique. People are attacking him because he's not performing, and there should be other players. But players go through these patches, and you need time. And Luis Enrique knows that for his system, Ferran Torres is one of the players that is going to implement it the best way. So of course now people are criticizing him, but it's football, and I know the player's aware of this, of course, and he just needs to get past this bad patch, and hopefully he'll be better again.
Well, it's the 55 million euros too. I know that's always
I
going to
know,
be the
I know,
stumbling
I know, but still,
block.
I
It's always the
mean,
price. The price tag is always a thing that people are going to bring up,
yeah.
and that's totally fair. But again, it's a situation, right? That the revenue that Barcelona had to spend with over the summer when they brought in Lewandowski and Koundé, and they didn't pay premium dollar for those players from what they arguably could have been worth. But last January, it was desperate, and I think Ferran Torres was the player that was available. And the fact that Barcelona kept their spot in the Champions League, like, and not to say that, oh, he's a success already, but his contract is not much. Like, he doesn't make that much on the wages and the salary, and so getting stuck in that, like that, because the price tag is the one that makes the headline. But truly, it's like, what is his salary? What is his wages week to week? And what is he doing to hurt your salary cap? And for a 22-year-old player with his kind of, I mean, even resale value, like even though his market value is down now, his resale value is still quite high. So
Yeah,
I'm
for sure.
not too concerned about what that price tag was, because again, that was also dictated by the market. And so because Barcelona finished top four, they got their Champions League spot that they needed to get. That tells me that it's kind of already done, right? If that makes any sense. Like I'm done with that price tag, because that was a direct catalyst to what they were able to achieve. So he was part of them playing well last year with Aubameyang and flying high. So I mean, not to say that it's already over for him, but the price tag was 2021, 2022, and I'm not concerned with that because of what his wages are. But okay, so next one here. Let's do one from Albert. Does the impressive start to the season actually indicate that Xavi is a great manager, or is he mainly down to transfers and informed players? How much credit are you giving Xavi, I think, is the summing up of that question.
Well, I mean, definitely Xavi deserves his credit, but I mean, I always think that the players are the main guys here. They're the ones getting the goals, they're the ones performing, they're the ones that if they have a bad day, it doesn't matter what the manager tells you, you're gonna have a bad day. So I mean, the manager can only do so much, but of course, he needs to allow them to get the best out of each other. He needs to allow them to play in the best possible way to get the good results. And in this sense, I do think that Xavi has had an impact. I think there's been a clear difference from before Xavi with Koeman, with Valverde, etc., and now with Xavi, he's brought in his ideas, his style of football, which of course maybe relates more to what Barcelona fans want. But of course, when you have Rafinha, when you have Lewandowski, when you have a good Dembele, when you have Ansu Fati, etc., I mean, there's a lot of quality on that field. So no matter what, you're going to get goals. So I mean, I do give credit to credit to Xavi, of course, but I still think he has lots of things to improve on. There's games where, for example, I'm not so convinced with his substitutions, where he brings in players which I think maybe don't make that much sense, or he changes the formation. And you can tell he's a bit anxious to maybe get a goal or something like that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But of course, that's the manager's decision in the end. But I do think that some things need to be improved, especially also in defense. But overall, he's doing a good job. He needs time, like you were saying with Ferran Torres. New players need time. Coaches at Barca also need time, even if he knows the club inside out. His ideas have to be transmitted, and it's going to take a while to fully get the machine working fully. So in that sense, credit to Xavi, and mainly credit to the players, because I think we have a very, very strong squad at the moment, and that is very easy going forward to compete in important titles.
Yes, it's easy to compete for the titles. It's another whole thing to win it. And I think where
Exactly.
Xavi is, I think where our referendum on Xavi will be decided will certainly be in the spring when the things matter. I mean, that's how it's
Yeah.
been for again, for Ernesto Valverde, he had his ups and his downs. I keep mentioning him, but it's because he won some trophies at Barcelona. He didn't win all of them, but he stayed a ship for a long season. I mean, he could have had an unbeaten season, but because of the 1-5-4 result against Levante, we talk about that season differently because they also failed in Europe in the way they did, right? So 2 matches completely derail a narrative of a manager, and that's unfortunately the game you play, right? It's a high stakes game of you win some, you lose some,
It
and the
is.
ones you lose are the ones that are remembered, unless you can win the big ones. And even then, I mean, look at Tuchel at Chelsea. I mean, he was already fired. I mean, that's a bit too quick on the trigger, and I'd be
Yeah.
frustrated if Barcelona had done that similar timeline, but it is what it is. Okay, next one, Pancho. How do you rate Rafa Marquez's Barça Athletic? The results and start have been better that of Barcelon's. You can say that again. Do you see positive development in these young players and is promotion feasible this year? Now, I'll try to answer that in a second here because we also have a question from Doug about Pablo Torre, about realistic expectations and Pablo Torre. But I want to rearrange this question for you a little bit, Roman, in that how important do you think promotion is for Barca Athletic? I feel like this is something that, we kind of discuss about and people have their different opinions. Some people just don't care at all. Like it doesn't really matter because you have Gabi I think Gabi should be playing with what is it? The Cadet A, or no, not the Cadet, Juvenal Bay right now at the U17 level, or the U18 level rather. So, I mean, he should be with the U18s, and yet he's been in the first team for 2 years. So it's like age doesn't really matter so much, but when it comes to the youth academy, but how important do you think that promotion is, and how necessary it is for positive results to equal believing in these players at first team level?
Well, basically, I mean, playing in second division, it's the closest you can get to playing in the first division here in Spain. So, of course, you're going to have much more competitive teams, much more tactically worked out, much more physical. So you're giving the younger players a possibility to play not at the highest level, but very close to it. So that's the best way, basically, to develop them, to train them. Of course, there are exceptions where Ansu Fati's and Gavi's that they're just so good that they don't really need to go through that phase and they just can jump right into the first team. But most players can't really do that. Those are massive exceptions. And we have been, before these guys, we have been missing, a lot of talent coming up to the first team. And it could be in part because of this, because you need not just to work on scouting players, on developing them from the bottom, but also like keeping them at a consistent level. And to do that, well, you need to play them against the best possible rivals. And in Segunda División, that's definitely a great test for them. And if they can perform well at that level, then most likely they'll have a good chance at succeeding. Maybe not at Barcelona, but at least at another first division club in La Liga where they'll end up competing. For example, we've seen Tello move out. We've seen other guys like Cuenca back in the days, Ricky Puig, who's going to now play in LA, and he's doing pretty well there. So, I mean, sometimes Barca is a bit too much, but they can still prove to being worthy of other decent teams, we could say.
Yeah, I will say that I want to put an emphasis on training and first team training in particular at FC Barcelona because, this is a necessary anecdote. But so I work at the professional ultimate frisbee team here in New York, and there are players who only play once or twice a year. And they've been on the team for 3 or 4 years, and they show up every Wednesday, and they show up in their away jerseys while everyone else wearing the home jerseys as they're not put in active roster. And, I'll talk to them about it. Like, you probably could be playing or be the primary person somewhere else, right? Like you could have more minutes somewhere else or be a starter because the team went undefeated. They won a championship. They're the top team in the league. And they tell me that playing in practice Wednesday in and Wednesday out against the best players in the entire sport, in the entire league, the championship. I mean, one of the greatest teams ever assembled, playing against those players and defending them and dealing with them is just making them so much better than even playing some kind of other, for another team in a league or another, not a league, but in another situation where they might have more to do, but they're not necessarily going to be a challenge to do what they do well. And even defensively, they're not going to have to guard these kind of players.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're talking about their personal development and just explaining like, I'm also going to be part of a championship winning mentality and figure those things out. So I think we cannot underestimate how significant. And you're also looking at it too. This season, we're hearing about the players. I mean, Lamine Yamal made all these big headlines because he got called up to first team training, and they come out with a compilation reel of him. And Xavi is going down all the way to the Juvenal Bay level, or I think maybe it's all 1 or 2 from Cadet A, that the U16s, and he's bringing them up and having them do first team training. And that is not only to get a look at them, but to kind of get their feet wet and have them do important things if they're not necessarily getting, if they're bossing whatever division they're in, which usually is what Barca does. So let me add to that too. How do I rate them? I mean, they've not conceded in 4 matches. They're second in the table right now. And not to say I'm changing my tune a little bit, but I'm not sure how much I care about promotion if Xavi is going to be looking at these players in that fashion. Like if you're defending Sergio Busquets in training, I think, and you're doing that twice a week, I think that goes a lot farther than having to contend with, no offense, but some defensive midfielder at the bottom of the second division. I mean, I think it's just a different level. And I know, match speed is something different that players have to get used to. But when you're playing for Barcelona's first team as a young player, you're playing a role though. Like you're not the main person. You're not going to have to step outside of your comfort zone. You're going to have to be whoever you are. And, maybe it's like the romantic in me, but, when I look at the teams in their group even, that I'd say, well, I'd kind of rather see Atletico Baleares in the second division. I don't know about Mallorca staying up in the top, but I mean, those two having a battle in the second division is always a fun thing. Numancia, like I'm just reading here, but Murcia, you have different teams in that second division, Real Union, Cornea, who have just kind of a rich history. And it means a lot more for those clubs because, again, that's their top team of their clubs. And it means a lot more for those clubs to get promotion in the second division than it does for Barcelona's B team, if that makes any sense. Like Barcelona Athletic are not going bankrupt anytime soon. And some of these teams...
Sorry. From a follower's perspective, of course, I mean, it doesn't maybe have too much of an impact, but I do think that from a manager's perspective, you still want them competing at the highest level, even though if they're training with Busquets and all that, of course, that's a positive and that really helps them develop. But I think it was Pep Guardiola who said this once, that in the Premier League, they have a big problem where youth squads don't really have like a second division where they play against the best players. They play between each other, and there is where they maybe lack like capability of building their own selves as players, and improving. And he was complaining about this, saying that in La Liga and in Spain, of course, for example, they have the second division, they play against them. That's where the players learn to play not the highest level, but to get close to there. So I mean, in a way, I think both things can kind of work together in a way. We could say both arguments.
For sure. Right. As a Kool-Aid, I'd want them to play at the highest level. But again, it's not even a romantic, but, as somebody that kind of cares about the total health of Spanish football, I'd like to see the clubs that kind of need to fill the stadiums to keep that competition up.
True.
And Barca Athletic can find their way. But then the question that Doug asked about Pablo Torre. So I will say I did watch 2 Racing Santander games, so not to say I'm an expert last season, but it was also in the grainiest way imaginable. But it was clear by the matches I saw, not just highlight packages, but the matches I saw, that the games were going at his pace. And that is what always impresses me about young players and about someone like Pablo Torre. Young players who can put their fingerprint on a match and you go, oh, I mean, that's why Pedri is just so incredible. That's why I continue to just say that it's not even his output. I'm not worried about his goals and assists. It's that there are games that just go the way Pedri wants them to go. And that is the biggest compliment I can give these young players. And that's a lot different from even a young player. We would think about Alan Halilovic from a few years ago. So not to be too harsh on Halilovic, but he was brilliant in those highlight packages or even in small bursts, watching him for the B team. So, I mean, Barca could come out of a training session with a really great highlight of Halilovic and go, look at this young teenage Croatian that we have coming up through. And even what he did in Croatia was pretty dynamic and awesome. And you think, oh, this kid's special. But I think Pablo Torre, for Xavi in particular, is a bit more useful, which is kind of what you need from a young player. You need them to be useful, and that's how they're going to get minutes, more so than being a player that's going to have 1 or 2 minutes and you go, oh, this player's incredible. It's kind of like the Ilaix Comas thing right now, where you watched him for the U16s and the U18s and the U19s, and Ilaix Comas, when he was 16, 17, you watch these dribbling highlights and you go, yeah, this kid's untouchable for like 3 minutes of a game. But what's he doing for 90 other, or for the 87 other minutes? Like, where is he? He kind of gets lost a little bit. He drifts a bit. And what I'm really impressed about Ilaix so far, what I've seen this year, is that he's a bit more, we'll say, tuned in to the entirety of a match, which is what you need. And adding that finishing product, that was a big knock against him. But if a player of his age can kind of stay engaged and make an impact throughout the duration of a game, that's, again, what's going to get you first team minutes more than these again, a minute of a highlight or 2 minutes of highlights or even some Golazo because Xavi's watching the whole match. So I think for Pablo Torre this year, it will take him time I said about Ferran Torres giving these young players
Mm-hmm.
time. It's going to take him time to understand the defensive duties of playing as an interior in Xavi's system, because you could argue that interior is kind of the most essential spot other than the guy up top who puts the goals in terms of Xavi's system. And then Frank Kessié even isn't fully doing what Xavi needs him to do just yet. And so he's not even fully maximizing the minutes that we'd expect that he was going to get, having just won a Serie A title with AC Milan. So all indications, though, for Pablo Torre is that Xavi will be playing him. Before you know it, the Copa del Rey will be in full swing. And even with this month of October, we could see him, especially with that backline injured, players kind of hobbling around. And I know it's not in the midfield, but I get the sense that every player in that first team dynamic will kind of get some time as other players need a minute's rest. And Torre will get some of those minutes so you don't burn out players. I mean, even a Frankie de Jong, like, is he going to be playing center back at all? Is he going to be, in the midfield? Is he going to still substitute in for Busquets at the pivot spot, right? To get Busquets some time again, because Barca's playing every 3 or 4 days.
Mm-hmm.
So there's going to come minutes where you're going to go, I mean, they could really use Pablo Torre as like a third or fourth sub off the bench to kind of close out this game for 15 or 20 minutes. And I think that Xavi trusts him in that kind of position. Like, it's not like, oh, this kid is not ready for prime time. It's that, we got to blood him along slowly. And I do trust him in those kind of circumstances. I think those are fair expectations for him to kind of try to get, what would you say, Román? Like,
Yeah, I
500
mean,
minutes? Like 400 minutes? I'm trying to put a number on it. Like 400 to 600 minutes? Is that a success?
I
But
think
with the
seeing how it started, at least, probably would, because I mean, you just can't have a young player like Pablo Torres sitting on the bench. I think that's the worst for such a guy, such a young person who needs to keep growing and developing his football. So I was a bit worried seeing in the first few games that he wasn't playing, or I think the last game he wasn't even on the bench. I think that's not good for him. At least play him with the B team, get him to have football in his feet. To keep playing with the ball, to keep developing and learning. Because if you have him on the bench, it's just kind of, why did we sign him for? So now seeing that, of course, as you mentioned, the Copa del Rey is going to come up. There's lots of injuries. Frankie de Jong, for example, he's going to be out for a bit. And then Frank Kessié, as you also mentioned, hasn't really fully adapted to the system. Maybe that could be an opportunity for Pablo Torre, but the fact is that they have to make him play as much as possible. And if they see that he's not going to play too much with the first team, and that the B team, he doesn't want to play because apparently he wanted to go straight to the first team, of course, which makes sense, then maybe loan him out or do something, but not have him on the bench. That's definitely the worst case scenario, in my opinion. But I do think, as you said, that he can be very useful in the upcoming months, especially with the World Cup in between. After that, we're likely going to lose some players. We're likely going to have to rotate even more. It's very uncomfortable for clubs and coaches to have this World Cup right there squished in the middle, because there's no proper rest after that. So that's maybe where Pablo Torre can come in, and be helpful, because we've seen he has quality. Of course, he still needs time also. Hope people give him time and don't go jump onto him too quickly, because I mean, he's a very young player, and he's really also skipped, gone straight up to the first team, which is something you don't see very often, because the likes of Gabi, Pedri, Ansu, those are really, really big exceptions. These kind of players don't turn up very often, so you have to make the most of this. And if Pablo Torre gets his minutes, even if he doesn't do too well, just let him have time, enjoy him and see how it goes. Give him a year, give him even 2 years if necessary, because I mean, these youngsters need a lot of time, as you mentioned earlier on, to develop and to improve and to learn the Barca system, we could say.
Well, yeah, like Yusuf Demir, even last season, like, he was not only given no time, but he still had a market value, and so he was shipped out because he had a market value.
Yeah, it was the money.
And that's good.
We needed the money at that point, basically. I think.
Yeah, and that was a good point about Pablo Torre and kind of this break too, because usually what we see with young players in their first seasons at these major clubs is that they kind of have a slow fall, and then beginning of the winter time, and then over that, not to say holiday break, but they kind of figure things out by time the January rolls around. And usually there's that international break in January where you kind of, the players get some confidence with their U21s or wherever it is, and they kind of figure some things out as the spring goes along. And what's really interesting is, I think more so than almost any other year, because of the World Cup and this month and a half break that is so uncharacteristic of the calendar, it's never happened before, that I think you're going to see a lot of young players kind of take those kind of bigger leaps than we're expecting, if that makes sense. Like, I think all over, not just for Barcelona, all over, you're going to see, like, there's that, I should have written it down, but Zaire, I know, is one of the names for PSG, their defensive midfielder, 16-year-old. I think all of a sudden that kid's going to come back from being kind of off for training, PSG training for a month and a half, and you're going to go, oh, this kid's now a regular part of their rotation, that kind of thing, which kind of leads me to some other questions we have here about formations. And Colette asked one about Busquets, who should replace him. Well, I did like a 25-minute thing over the offseason about this, about all the different candidates, and that one's already kind of thrown away just because things change, players sign for different spots. And so it looked like if Zubamendi from Real Sociedad is extending with Real Sociedad, it seems like he's been tipped as the guy. But if he's extending, that's going to not say put him out of the price range, but I think his price range is 60 million. Or, I mean, that's even a bit high for me, I think, for that kind of player.
Yeah.
I think really his market value should be like 35 to 55. I mean, I think he's getting better. He's 23. He's kind of already a bit of what he is. And if that's exactly what Barcelona needs, then go out and get him. But I think paying more than like 55 is just, it's extending a bit of what that player is worth. I think you got to kind of hold your ground on that. But then the next one is Ruben Neves from Wolverhampton. I like, that's the next candidate. And I say, don't overthink it. Like, he's 25. He's in his prime. He's very press resistant. His long balls are some of the best in Europe. So you kind of just say, if they want to play in his prime, that's going to be the guy. And from what we saw in preseason too, I'm going to throw out one other candidate here. I don't want to rule out Nico either. Nico Gonzalez in the preseason looked just fine there. Even if he's playing as an interior in front of Guillamon at Valencia right now, I know like that loan is like, oh, he's playing as an interior, but I think there's a lot of different ways that works out for him. And he comes back as just an all-around better player and kind of ready to play the pivot spot, especially if that being Busquets extends for one extra season, which I think that he might. And then Nico just kind of becomes his full understudy next year, and they go all aboard with that because there's so many other names. There's a teenager for Rennes in France. They brought another one in after Camavinga. But I think there are timelines. Like, now we're already looking at that next generation of defensive midfielders who are 16, 17, 18, 19 and going, oh, are they ready? And the problem is almost none of those players are ready for prime time. So it's all about timelines. It's what players can take the opportunities when that legend is leaving, in the moment that they're leaving.
Yeah, and to this, I want to add that also it's important to point out that Busquets is a unique. I mean, and no player we bring in is gonna be Busquets, because sometimes people expected the new Xavi, the new Iniesta, now the new Busquets. That's just not going to really happen, because Busquets is a fantastic, incredible player that we still need him at his age because we don't have a proper replacement. And the names you mentioned, I mean, they're definitely decent players. But of course, there's a big question mark behind how they'll perform. Maybe they'll come to Barca and they'll find out that they're just not made for the club, So it's a very difficult spot to cover. We thought that maybe Frankie the Young could do it at some point, but when he's played there, he's been okay. But of course, people see Busquets after, and it's like, he's not as good as Busquets. Or when Nico was playing there, he's not Busquets. So that's the problem. The comparison there with Busquets is always going to affect or in a way the other player that comes on to play in his position. So I mean, whoever it is, will have to just accept that it's going to be a completely different player with different style, different ideas, etc. going forward. And I mean, in my case, I'd like to see Nico there. I think, a player that's been in our youth system that has done really well. He could definitely be an option. Hopefully in Valencia, he will grow and he can come back from that loan as a better, more complete player. But it's hard to say at the moment who the right man would be. It's true that Zubimendi, as you mentioned, has been talked about a lot. So he's definitely a very strong candidate. But again, I mean, he's no Busquets, and I'm just worried that any player that starts there instead of him is going to be quite maybe criticized, we could say, in a way.
100%, for sure. The reading of the game, you don't replace legends like that like overnight. It doesn't happen. And that play is going to take time and patience. And as you know, with Kool-Aid, patience is not necessarily a shot yet. Okay, so three topics left remaining. This one I think we can do rather quickly. Peter and Noah both asked about formations. With so many injuries, do you think it is now sensible for Xavi to trial his 3-4-3? And Noah, with the lack of fullbacks on the right side, could we finally see three center backs, or Roberto and Baldy on the wings? Could we see a back three of an Alonso, a Piqué/Christensen, and a Garcia? I'm going to say, Román, that because of those injuries, it's actually counterintuitive. And I actually think Xavi's going to stick with a 4-3-3. And I think he'd rather jam does that make sense, right? He'd rather jam a square round hole at one position than change the formation.
Yeah, exactly. And also, if you play your three center backs, for example, you play Piqué, Christensen, and Eric. What if one gets injured? It really complicates things. So I think his idea will be to play with four at the back. He'll just have to figure out who to put on the left. Who to put on the right. If to move one of the left backs, if to move somebody else. I don't know what his plan is in that case. Unless Sergio Roberto, of course, is available by then, so he'll probably start if that's the case. But I just don't see him risking three center backs. And also, it's a formation that hasn't really worked too well, in my opinion, for Xavi at the moment. He's tried it a few times. Uh, he's also tried it towards the end of games where the team has been struggling, trying to get the extra goal because, of course, that gives you more firepower going forward, and it did work. But honestly, I'd rather he stick to a 4-3-3, which is more reliable. I think the team plays it better. And if towards the end of the game you want to try something else and you see you can or you need to, then all right. But I think Xavi will stick to what he knows best, which is the 4-3-3.
Yep, yeah, we're in agreement there. This next one is actually pretty easy. Boston asks, what's the difference in revenue earned when the team has a poor, average, or excellent season across all streams of revenue? I know you want numbers from me, but the simple answer is millions of euros is actually the answer. Remembering the pandemic only changed the budget by less than 100 million euros, and that was after the pandemic and all that revenue lost, which, it doesn't seem like a lot. It does seem like a lot, that being 100 million euros, but that number is actually a lot smaller than the wages and salary going out and the gate revenue that is now returned. So right now, Barca has the highest attendance in Europe, around 85,000 people per match. Some are going to the museum throughout the week if they're traveling, if they're tourists, and tourism, Barcelona has opened up again. So that's how Barcelona get out of debt, is that they have people show up and pay money to support the club and care about the club. And that's how Barca plan ahead with their budgets too.
Yeah.
And trophies is the whole promise of that continuing. So when you say excellent season, you mean one where they not only did some winning, had an exciting team, but also won trophies, which excites them for next season. So next season is impacted by the end of this season, unfortunately. And this season was impacted by the number of signings, like Lewandowski and Koundé, and like the team that they are, as in the best defense in Europe and flying high, and they have won. I mean, they're unbeaten this year other than the Bayern match and 0-0 with Rayo Vallecano, which is still a draw. And other than that, it's all wins. And it's a lot of goals. They're pouring a lot of goals, and people are excited to see that. So I don't want to oversimplify that. But yeah, the difference is when Barcelona have bad years, people leave. And I can tell you, again, from firsthand experience, hosting this podcast and doing this Barcelona podcast empire, when it comes to merchandise and listeners and downloads and and sponsorships, like numbers matter. People care.
Absolutely.
That's it.
And I just wanted to add that proof of this is also the fact that Barca could have not signed anybody, and just use the youth team these next few years to try and recover economically. But their other option, which is to spend money, bring players, and have a quick, immediate impact, winning titles if possible, winning games, bringing more fans to the stadium, because they know that it's really important for the team to get high attendances, to get money in as soon as possible. So I mean, there were two options, and they went for a riskier one maybe, but it's also an option. So it's very important for a team to win, as you can see in this case.
Well, speaking of winning, speaking of risky, and speaking of the end of the show, here's our last topic. I hope it doesn't take us too long, but I could actually ask it in one question. Tamir, no disrespect, Tamir, you had a big, long question here, but I'm going to simplify it for Román. Messi returning next year. Are you giving it a thumbs up? Are you giving it a thumbs down? But I think Tamir really wants to ask, formation-wise, how would it work? I mean, it's also financially. I think that's really the question that the club is asking. But as far as what it would do to the team, that would be a question with Lewandowski here and Dembele and Rafinha. It seems like there's too many cooks in the kitchen. But obviously, Messi is always the master chef that returns, and you go, oh, we'll find a place for him in the kitchen, no matter what, because it's Lionel Messi.
Yeah, I mean, in my case, it's a thumbs up. I'm a romantic. I just think that he left in the worst possible way, to a European rival, to a club I think many Barca fans pretty much hate, we could say, or don't, or dislike.
Their president this week, I mean, you heard what he had said yesterday and today.
Can't stand the guy. Can't stand stand any of them.
yeah, nonsense.
But I mean, I just think that he's such an incredible player. I mean, he's so good. He's given us so much. Of course, the easy thing would be just to dismiss it and just say Messi is over. We're done with that. We don't need more problems. But if the club can make it work, only if they can make it work, of course. If Messi can bring down his pretensions and have reduce his salary, of course, then why not? He's a fantastic player. He's still got quality. We see it weekly. Of course, maybe he's not scoring as much, as he used to, but he's taken on a different role in PSG where he moves the ball, gives those assists, and I think Messi is an incredible player. Sorry, and in terms of the formation, I really don't know if Xavi has really looked into that yet. I think that's something that still has to come if it happens, and at that point they will look into it. But I mean, there's always a role for Messi. It's a matter of finding his position. Of course, other players would be affected by this. It could be Rafinha, could be Dembele, could be Ansu, could be Lewandowski himself, which I doubt. But of course, it's complicated. But at the moment, what we know is that Xavi likes very complete squads with a big bench. So in that sense, he doesn't mind having Rafinha's, Dembele's, etc., Ferran Torres on the bench because he wants to rotate. He wants to change for different games. He knows that they get injured very often. So I mean, I'm sure they could make space for Messi, and it would be great to have him back. I can't say how he's going to perform. I still think he'd be great, but yeah, in my case, I'd love to see him back at least one more season. To give him a proper goodbye, which is something we also really missed. But in terms of formations and all that, still a while. Still has to happen first.
Yeah, well, I'd say before we think about the tactical stuff, if you're going to go out and try to quote unquote replace Busquets, and I'm not going to sign, if you're going to sign Messi or return Messi, you're not going to sign Zubamendi or anyone that you'd expect to be the pivot in a Barcelona style. You're just going to ask China if they could borrow the Great Wall and just put that down in the middle of the field. Because I think if you put Messi going forward, or you try to make something work with four at the top with Lewandowski and Dembele and Rafinha and Messi, I think you have kind of a problem on your hands with everything in behind, because you basically need, I mean, Pedri already runs around too much and puts out too many fires, but I don't know what you'd possibly do. I think what is everybody else as a center back, and that's all you do. You don't even play midfield. You
Yeah.
just have, you have one Pedri at the midfield and then all center backs.
Yeah, although the Cruyff mentality was this: always score more goals than your opponent. So if they score 6, we score 7. And with those players, I'm sure we could.
Yeah, I think Barca's doing that right now.
Also, yeah.
So I think it would also be very dependent, to be serious, it'd be very dependent on whether or not the league account his last salary, like they tried to do with Alves. That was an interesting thing about signing Alves, where he tried to sign on the minimum, and they said, no, we're actually going to count was half of what your last salary was. And even Messi at his last salary, if that were to count against Barca's budget, would completely destroy anything they tried to do with their wage structure. So while Alves' goodbye came in that little spurt of 6 months, and then he kind of got it wasn't a testimonial, but he kind of got his farewell with the Gamper Trophy with Pumas, which again wasn't even meant to be the real thing because of Roma dropping out. That was the whole thing. But it did wind up putting a nice cherry on top of Alves' career, even though he was wearing a different shirt. And it was kind of felt like, okay, this is the proper end. And, I kind of went down this real quick final rabbit hole that we heard, about, we see, at least I don't know about you, but I grew up hearing about testimonial matches, and especially with that class of Beckham's Manchester United class. You already hear about testimonials for those kind of players, and hey, how are we going to have this big fanfare at the end of it? And then I got to wondering why I felt like we heard more of these back in the day than we do now. And that's because apparently clubs generally only give testimonial matches to players having 10 years of service with the club, and you're retiring with that club, which, with the way that modern football works and the market, particularly the post-2017 market with Neymar, you don't often see players riding off in the sunset with the clubs that are big enough where a testimonial match would make the headline. So I looked at it, and there are testimonial matches happening in Belgium and in Denmark and in Sweden and in Italy in the lower divisions, and they're happening and they exist, but you don't see them at Man City or Juve or Bayern, right? Because you don't really see these players finishing the careers at those clubs. I mean, even Andres Iniesta, where he had, for all intents and purposes, his final match kind of was a testimonial match, like, because Barca are good enough where they can kind of play a match against a real match that counts, but kind of count it as like, hey, goodbye to this legend, and that's kind of how that works.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think when Laporta, and we all agree that Messi did not leave in the right way, I think there is a chance that he does kind of the basketball or the baseball here in the United States move. He signs a one-day deal and he has that testimonial match, and that's it. Like, that's all that Laporta could mean, right? That's all that the club can mean. Like, we just have to do this and say goodbye the right way to bring him back into our world, to mean that, hey, in retirement, you're an FC Barcelona legend. Like, because, I mean, this is the cynical part of it, but that man is going to be a cash cow even when his boots are hung up. He's going to continue to be a market resource that if he's a legend at Barcelona is saying, hey, I know he retired with PSG, but I'm trying to think of an example of a player that retired at their kind of new club, their second club, and they kind of became a long-time person there, like a general manager or whatever. Like there are many examples of that, actually, of them, like, because that's where their final move is. Like Messi has now moved to Paris. His home is in Paris. I know he probably has, with the money he makes, he probably has them in Spain too. But anyway, like his big home or his final home is in Paris. What if he just stays there and now he's like a PSG ambassador, right? Like I don't see that happening, but the club also, I think Barcelona would hate for that to happen. So I don't know if we're actually talking about Messi's return as a playing return, as it is like just his kind of role as a figurehead in the club.
Yeah, it could be a possibility. I mean, at some point, Messi's going to come back to Barcelona. I don't know whether it's a player or whether it's going to be some sort of position at the club, but what's for sure is that he'll come back. He said it himself, he wants to be back. Also, his family was based here. He loved living here. I'm sure he still kept his house here in Barcelona and Castelldefels in the outskirts. So, I mean, in that sense, I think Messi will come back. Also, the question is whether he wants to go to the US to play football, because apparently he still has that wants to live that experience. And as you were saying before about players having that game before they retire, also keep in mind that now there's so many clubs, especially clubs in Africa, Middle East, etc., that offer them so much money to go there and maybe get some more money into their pocket before they retire, that it's a big temptation. So it's actually quite difficult, as you were saying, to get a player to retire in his club nowadays.
Yeah. So, I mean, the last thing I'll say to kind of add on to last week, that while it was reported last week that PK's contract was at 52 million, apparently that has been redone. Not even as far as like really, but as far as was being reported, and apparently the number's like 37 now, which actually does put him less than Frankie de Jong. So I put it too much on PK last week, but that has been revised now on places like Apology or having those the new number verified, if you will. But either way, PK is still making. The sentiment remains the same. Busquets, De Jong, Alba, PK are making astronomical amounts. The only thing of those four is that Busquets' contract is out at the end of the season, and I think he's, again, the big question mark. So, Román, we had a lot of questions here, and I feel like we answered them all. We got it done in under an hour. I'm really proud of us. Nice. So thanks so much for coming on the show. And as I said last time you were on, this is appearance number 2, but I think people are still interested to hear more from you.
I'd love to join anytime, so it'd be great to come whenever you let me.
And in the meantime, where can people find your work?
Well, as you said before, at La Liga Lowdown in our Twitter account, so you can find us. Or we even just opened a Substack this season. So we're producing content, articles, weekly newsletters, etc. So there they can find us. Or in my personal Twitter handle, which is Aeroslave with a double E at the end.
Yep, and that will be down in the show notes below. So click through and then find all that juicy stuff. We obviously, Rory Barlow is a favorite on the Liga Lowdown as well. Has been on this show many times. So yeah, Liga Lowdown doing some great stuff over there. And again, also the conversations are more than just Barcelona, right? I feel like I get a little tired sometimes.
Yeah, it's La Liga in general.
Exactly. So you guys get it done over there. So we're also on Twitter and Instagram at the Barcelona Pod. Close Facebook group is where we got these listener questions. Answer the question, like in, and there's also a match thread, and that's kind of where the community is fostered there. Patreon is how I keep making these shows, and you can also watch them not watch them, but listen to them without the ads, which again is the incentive to support the show over on Patreon. And then on YouTube, we had all that summer content that came out. I just did a FIFA 23 ratings, kind of stepped outside my comfort zone and got corrected by quite a few, I believe, teenagers on the internet because I definitely misspoke. I've had FIFA since FIFA 99, but I don't do any of the online content. Don't talk to me about Ultimate Team. Don't talk to me about any of the extra bonus content or DLC. I just learned what that meant the other day, downloadable content. So I'm working on it. I'll get into the 21st century eventually. But either way, thanks so much for listening to the show. Until next time, we'll talk to you soon. And Forza Barça.